All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of our discussion about the ADHD and the hunter-gatherer brain. I'm going to go ahead and start recording this. And yeah, welcome everybody. It's a beautiful morning here in Snoqualmie Valley, hanging out in traditional Snoqualmie territory. I think some of you know I shared this story about this awesome thing that happened with the tribe. Not only have they been really involved with the ancestral lands movement around this area, they recently were able to purchase 12,000 acres, basically that way, of the Tolt River drainage to reclaim some of their traditional land and own it outright. And it was, I think, land that had been promised to them in treaties that they did not receive. And so pretty awesome. I don't know the exact location yet, but I know somewhat where it is, and it's awesome. Both my wife and I were hoping that someday something like that might happen to take care of that, watershed that we're a part of. And yeah, this is part 2 of a series. I'll probably do 3 or 4 on this topic about our brain and ADHD in the modern society and our sort of hunter-gatherer and our hunter-gatherer needs. And it's a beautiful day here, one of those crisp, clear days, the days when here in the Pacific Northwest in Cascadia, where you just want to get outside. Like it just, like being inside is like really hard. And the rare days of like pure sunlight in the winter time or early spring, you're like, I want to get outside. And really that comes to the heart of what we're talking about here. So last week, or a couple weeks ago, I just talked about, writing on my book Primal, and the chapter I put in there on free-range children and what happens when we start to help kids with these sort of approach to putting in hunter-gatherer-esque routines into their lives and how that can help them out. And it's a very controversial chapter. I shared with people it was kind of the most controversial point in the book. And the thing that was really controversial was presenting this idea that actually what's happening when we put these labels on people, kids, adults, whoever it is, and around ADHD or even some of the other labels that are out there, that if we take those people and then give them a significant and sufficient time in nature, a lot of times they actually excel out in a natural setting, and then sometimes they're able to go back into a classroom and function really well, or they just find a different way of being and using their brain in a different way. And we kind of came around to this conclusion through our discussion and through some of the sharing about the idea that really what we're facing is a form of pretty intense cognitive dissonance. And what cognitive dissonance is this concept that our brain is expecting one thing and it's getting something else. And I think we could make an argument, in fact, this is the premise of that book, Primal, that basically we're all living with cognitive dissonance all the time. And before I dive too much into that, I just want to also take a moment and acknowledge, what's happening in the world, happening in Ukraine, happening with Russia. Those things have impacts on us no matter where we are. And we live in a world where maybe once upon a time we wouldn't hear those kinds of things, but we do. And then it is an influence on our lives. And so, thoughts and good intentions out for everybody, for an easeful resolution to that situation, which doesn't look like it's going to happen. And I know there's like huge impacts for people. There's impacts of friends and family that I know of who have connections over there. Karen, my partner, a lot of their Qigong lineage folks are in either Russia or Ukraine, and so anyway, I just want to acknowledge that. So we live in this time of cognitive dissonance. And what is that cognitive dissonance? Well, it's this idea that our brain evolved with nature, and nature as the primary influence for sensory input and interaction for millions of years. We have been anatomically humans for 200,000 years of that. But our proto-human ancestors, it's like 7 to 8 million years. So 7 to 8 million years of us and our ancestral predecessors living with nature is the primary influence, primary matrix of interaction. In a much shorter period of time, where we were primarily indoors, sitting a lot, not moving, not really moving very much. And then you add into that things like screens and computers and what we're doing right now, actually, talking on screen. I was joking last week that some of the people who showed up for that talk, that they would probably, if I was a participant in the talk, what I would be doing is I'd be listening to it and walking around and probably be outside or something like that, and how that's a form of, what some people would call ADHD, that your brain actually functions better when you start splitting it into different things you're doing simultaneously. There are cognitive scientists out here who say that that's impossible, that we actually can't do that. And I laugh at that because that's how I function best. That's how my wife functions best. That's how my eldest child functions best. In fact, my eldest child was just explaining how a couple months ago, how they had gotten in trouble in their Spanish class because they were reading a book. And they were reading a book in English and the teacher's like, how can you possibly be doing that? Put your book away. And my eldest was saying, well, actually, this helps me pay attention to what you're saying, because if I just have to only pay attention to what you're saying and doing, it's not enough. It's not enough for me. And this reminds me of what it's like to be out in nature, where you're out, maybe you're sitting around a fire and you're listening to somebody, but you have a fire in front of you. You have the birds all around you. You can look out to the horizon. There's light interplaying on the leaves and the trees, and maybe there's like buds merging on some of those plants. And you can notice all of those things and pay attention to the person. And I'll be honest, I'm one of those people, like, I do have trouble listening to another person unless I have other sensory input, especially from the natural world. And it's better if I have the natural world. And I also can't really sit still for really long periods of time. Like, it's just really hard on me. So people were quite open the last time we got together, and they shared some really heartfelt stories of being parents, of their own struggles with this. And just want to acknowledge that, like, myself, my partner, my kids, like, we've all had various labels put on us around this. I don't think it's necessarily useful to like out everybody with whatever label they were put on or whatever, but some of the people in my family have been on medications for various things, related to what we're talking about. And all of us seemingly thrive with nature, and that actually whatever those challenges are actually get better or even go away when we have time in nature and connection to nature, especially when nature is the primary thing we're doing and interacting with on a daily basis. Now, but that's not the reality of our lives, right? Like, that's, most of us are living our lives, and that's not our job. That's not what we do. Once upon a time, it was my job. I was a field instructor at a wilderness awareness school for, but their adult programs and some of their kids programs for a while. And so that can be the primary thing. I also ended up, the last few years I was there, being in an office, working on a computer for 40 plus hours a week, and my friends, my colleagues could see the strain on me, and that wasn't probably a best match for my skill set. And so, how do we deal with this in the 21st century, right? Like, how do we relate to that cognitive dissonance? How do we actually optimize our lives? And it's funny because, a few years ago, I was offered this opportunity to write a book for Falcon Press. My first book is called Primal: Why We Long to Be Wild and Free. And I'm going to type that into the chat. And I wrote that book in many ways, very unconsciously. I had an outline, I had an idea of some people I wanted to talk to, but I sort of broke it down in these different categories unconsciously. And later I went back and looked at that, and I realized that those categories are actually how I organize my life to have my hunter-gatherer brain be happy in the modern world, or functional or optimized or whatever it is. And so when we're looking at our lives, when we're looking at our children's lives, that's a way to help that. And it's the way I actually ran my life when I was writing that book, where I had to be on the computer screen multiple hours a day doing research. I would do interviews and stuff, and I'd do the interviews usually outside on the phone, sometimes walking, or a good number of them walking and talking. But how could I make that work best? And it seemed like the best way to make it work best was actually how I organized the book, which is kind of interesting. So later I was developing some programs around this idea of how do we optimize our life in the 21st century with this hunter-gatherer brain. And I started to write a little ebook. It's called Primal Nature, Rewilding Our Lives. And I discovered that very quickly I was choosing the same categories. And then I realized, oh, this is just the main things that I have used both when I was a teacher in the field with people sharing these things, when I worked an office job to, full time, and then when I've been writing and teaching online, that this is the sort of formula of like how to help our brains, body, beings, mind, body, spirit, energy in this modern time. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to type this stuff into the chat. And I'm going to just list a few things out. And I know that you can hear me typing, those of you who are live or you who are watching this recording. I understand. I know that's not everybody's favorite thing, so sorry about that. All right. So I'm just going to start with these ones today. I might put the whole list out there today, and we can go in depth to these things. So what I've got here is our time in nature. This is our actual physical time outside in nature, away from our devices. I also put on here natural movement. That's a big category, and as a lot of you know who are tuning into this, it's one of my personal passions. But we'll discuss that. A relationship with our food that's more than just buying it from the grocery store prepackaged. A relationship with fire, and actually getting into the level of like foraging food or even growing food. So the first one with time in nature, and there's a reason why it's first, right? It's the primary. Our brains are designed to expect time in nature every day. It doesn't matter if we grew up in a heavy urban environment. It doesn't matter if we grew up in an apartment building. I've heard all sorts of stories of people who grew up in very urban environments and how they still played outside a ton as kids. And that was on rooftops, or that was in alleyways. And that even in those situations, they were getting the feel of the wind and the sunlight and hearing birds and bird language. So even in the city, there's pigeons, there's crows, there's lots of birds actually that live in the cities. So our brains are designed to calibrate, to be in nature and to receive that sensory input at least some time every day. And if we don't do that, there's a strong sense of disorientation. And orientation actually means like orienting to the environment around you. So if all of your sensory input is like just from your devices and not going outside, we're cutting ourselves off from a form of sensory nourishment that we really need. And so it's like, well, Nate, I work a job and I have to drive, or I have to commute, or I'm on the computer. It's like, great, just have some nature breaks. Spend at least 5 minutes in the morning, at least 5 minutes at noon, and at least 5 minutes at the end of the day, connecting with the weather, the temperature, the light, sounds from animals, seeing some green stuff. There's this whole thing about like our brains and green stuff. It's amazing how if we just actually, they found that if you actually paint, I've talked about this in my book actually, if you paint the walls green, even if you don't have plants, but if you just paint the walls green, most people's brains relax more because that's the primary color we're designed genetically to see and react with. And our eyes actually see more colors and shades of green than any other color. And that's because we're designed to interact with plants. You know, it's one of our primary food sources. So time in nature. Now you can do more than that. But if you do at least those 5 minutes, there's going to be some level of orientation that's happening every day. But you can take nature breaks at work. You know, not a lot of people realize this, but even 10, 15 years ago, it was quite common in this country that people took smoke breaks. It is not quite so common anymore where I live for people to take smoke breaks. It's like, because smoking has gotten, you know, kind of pushed more and more and more to the periphery. But people used to go outside because they wouldn't smoke inside. They would go outside and they would have a 15-minute smoke break. And they, you know, twice a day for 15 minutes, in addition to their lunch break. So we're actually all entitled to at least a 15-minute break in the morning and 15-minute break in the afternoon. It's actually legally binding for us to have that. So instead of during our breaks going and checking our devices or whatever, getting outside for 15 minutes of fresh air and sensory input will do wonders for people. You can mix this in things like going for walks, you know, over your lunch break, or, you know, at the end of the day going for a walk. And then of course, there's weekends, or there's times at the end of the day, as we get into the sunnier, warmer time in the Northern Hemisphere, there's times to be outside. And, you know, you can stack functions. Like my family and I, one of the things we do is we eat outside a lot of times, especially in the warm summer months. We'll just eat our dinner outside in the backyard. Even if it's hot, we'll go in the shade. And people laugh when I say hot, because they think I live in the Pacific Northwest and it just rains all the time. It can be quite hot and dry in summertime, and it was very hot and dry last summer. So just sitting in your backyard. If you live in an apartment, going out on your balcony, right? If you don't have a balcony, like finding a spot to go do a picnic, you know, with your family. All right, so I think everybody gets the concept of time in nature. And for some people, some kids in particular who are, you know, having challenging learning challenges, it may be really helpful to schedule in a lot of time in nature. There's pretty compelling research now that shows that kids who have ADHD, like an official diagnosis that may or may not be on medicine, if they are given time outside, even to just go on a walk in nature, and then come back into the classroom, their ability to function, to focus goes up drastically. All right, so I just want to pause here and also acknowledge that, and I've mentioned this before, but I just want to talk about it again, what's going on in Scandinavian cultures around this. And it's very interesting to check out Nordic culture and the relationship to school and education. I encourage people to do their own research about this. But from what I understand is in many Scandinavian cultures, Nordic cultures, Northern European cultures, most schools are turning towards being forest schools. Most kindergartens are actually kindergartens. Kindergartens means kids in the garden. They have time in nature built into their daily schedule every day. And they continue this for adults. And they have the highest test scores in the world when it comes to educational performance. And they have the happiest scores, happiest population in terms of mental, emotional health in the world. And I believe it's because they prioritize nature, because they have figured out what we're talking about here. All right, so natural movement. Yeah, like you'll see if you look at my classes, like they're kind of split into multiple genres. It's sort of like survival skills, plants, and stuff is one of them. And then another big category is movement. And I think I'd like to just start by saying, I'm pretty sure our bodies are not designed to just walk on flat, hard surfaces all the time. In fact, I have seen in myself and in people I've worked with, students, clients over the years, that if you can get them off of flat, hard surfaces at least a little bit every day or multiple times a week, they have huge improvements in their ankle, knee, hip, and back issues, sometimes even their shoulder issues. And this is the idea is that flat, hard surfaces are not what we spend all of our time on. And much of even our exercise that we do is very square. It's very focused in certain frames and not in like a lot of other ways. So the simplest way to get natural movement into your life is to just go outside and walk somewhere that's not paved. That's the basic, most underlying thing, and to try to do that a little bit every day. I have seen kids, I've worked with kids, and some of you maybe have it too, who they've literally spent almost their whole life on pavement. And then they come out to like a forest or they come out to a nature program and they literally kind of stumble around for the first day and they feel awkward and they feel kind of sometimes embarrassed or shy or they kind of shut down. But then after about 36 hours, and I don't mean 36 hours straight, I mean that they have a cabin that they can go into, but after about 36 hours of being in nature, all of a sudden those kids are like running and jumping and playing in the grass and, you know, hiding behind bushes and climbing over logs. And again, that's kind of like what our bodies, if our brains are designed for nature, our bodies are designed for nature too. So getting outside, moving in nature, moving on uneven surfaces in nature, moving up and down hills, walking on trails. If you have the opportunity to like climb or jump over logs, climb trees. There's a whole chapter in my book Primal that I wrote about this, about my wife Karen and her years of teaching in Seattle at what she called the Green Lake Dojo, where she taught a class at this park, a city park, Green Lake, and people would come after work and they would just like run around barefoot in the grass and climb trees and lift rocks and like climb on ropes and trees. And they just loved it. They lost their mind. And yeah, they got some physical fitness out of it, but that was not the primary focus. The primary focus was getting them to play outside. And again, what happens with our brains when we do that? Well, our brains get really happy and really nourished. And the diversity of what we do when we're outside, there's this whole thing in my book that I talk about the diversity of our movement is linked with the diversity of our thinking. And I didn't come up with this. I mean, I speculated that this was the case. And then I did research and found that, yes, there's clear evidence now that the more diverse our movement, the higher our degree of what's called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the ability for our brain to form new pathways. And so they study this mostly with seniors and how like giving seniors diverse ways of moving, especially dance, helps their brains like continue to grow and develop. But it's true for everybody. And it's especially true for kids. And if you watch kids, if you want to know what to do as an adult, you're like, well, what should I do in nature? Just watch how kids play in nature. They play with sticks. They run and jump. They play in the sand. They throw sand. They throw rocks in the water. Like how many people just love to throw rocks in the water? I've had a lot of success hanging out with adults, getting them outside, getting them to take off their shoes and barefoot, lift some rocks and throw some things in the water, and they're super happy. So time in nature and movement in nature. I'm going to talk about a couple more here for today, and then I'll just kind of go over the list with everybody. Our relationship with food. And I'll include foraging in this, though that's kind of it's also a separate category, but yeah, like what has been our primary job for most of our human existence? What was our main job? And our main job, our main occupation was making sure our basic needs were met, so that we had a shelter, we had fire, and we had water, and we had food. And if you're doing things right, the shelter and the fire are actually kind of semi-permanent. They're set up So they're kind of going on all the time. And probably historically you were near water. So food, gathering food and processing of food and maybe making some stuff was one of the main things we did as human beings. And so now we don't do that. I mean, some people do, but there's a huge percentage of people that are divorced from the process of being engaged with their food. And so whether it's gardening, whether it's going to the farmer's market, whether it's building a food forest, these are the kinds of things that our brain craves. And I spent some time, taking several courses with a teacher named David Crow. If you haven't heard of him, I highly recommend his work. And David really focuses these days, especially on medicinal herbs, and his foundation in Ayurveda. And he studied in Tibet and China, he studied in Tibet and India, and he has background in Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine. But for a while, he was really involved with gardening projects in urban areas and noticing there's this pretty huge correlation between urban garden programs and the lowering of crime and the ability of kids to work better in the classroom. And this is what I'm getting at, is that like we have these old needs hardwired into our brain. And one of those is around our relationship with food. And if we're so divorced from food that all we're getting is stuff literally from packages that we heat up, or even then we just get it, takeout, we're taking away a primary need that we all have. And I know it's not always easy, and not everybody has space. We can grow food, we can grow herbs on our kitchen counter. But having some way of interacting with food, going out to farms, if you live in the city, like going out to the farms in the country and like getting food from there, even that I think is a huge thing, and really good for kids to do. Growing what food you can, and then simple things like having a berry bush in your yard, like raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, whatever grows near you. And so the next level up from that is foraging, like going out and gathering some of your wild food yourself. And again, coming back to the Scandinavian cultures, this is one of the things that they were like, is built in Finland. Apparently, foraging is a national pastime for adults and kids. Like a huge percentage of people gather mushrooms, they gather berries, they gather all sorts of things. And so I have personally experienced, I've seen my kids experience, students, children, and then adults have some of their most satisfactory experiences, and their brains really thrive when they are out in nature and they gather some wild berries and they eat them. And the sensory satisfaction of finding the berries, knowing that they're safe, eating them, the sensory taste input on the tongue, how enlivened their brains become. So, all right, I'm going to pause, and I want to just give a chance for anybody who's here, Nicole and Jay, if you all have any questions or comments at this time. I'm gonna just take a break for a second.
Hey, Nate, this is Jay. Can you hear me?
Hey, Jay.
Hey, thank you for talking about this connection here. I think it's quite fascinating myself. And as someone who deals with a number of, I guess what they would call the categorical symptoms of ADHD, hallmark-wise, I found one of the more significant ones for me is time blindness,
Yes.
as a category that they would describe of really being able to finding yourself really lost in the moment, without any sort of external stimulus to snap you out of it. It seems like it's so easy just to get locked into a track, if you will, or locked into a path. And it's just interesting. I'm wondering what other, if you've noticed any other life forms um, outside of the human species that don't actually live in the moment, that are not actually, in this sort of categorically time blind state. Would that, if there aren't any other species that are, say, studied to be that way, then does that make us more natural than not? What does that
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. Hmm. Thank you for sharing, Jay. And yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think it gets right to the heart of what we're talking about here. So just to restate it, Jay, you were describing about time blindness, right? Which is one of those categories of neurodiversity that some people who have a label of ADHD or may or may not, that sometimes they experience. And it's as I understand it, and Jay, you can correct me here, it's for some people, it's literally the inability to break out of the moment, and also the inability to be able to quantify time, like the inability in some of the more deeper forms of that, the inability to know that, like, say, hey, this task is going to take 3 hours, or even really to be able to know how long 3 hours is, or something like that. Do I have that right, Jay?
Yeah, it's that it's really, yeah, being able to track time and have that what people would say, like, that sense of time. It's more than anything, I found that it's really hard to if there's something that really, and I find this mostly, if I go out on a wander, um,
Yep.
and I don't have something that's reminding me that I need to get back at a certain point, like, I could just go. I could just go, you know, I could probably just go until, like, I ran out of sustenance, or, whatever resources,
Mhm.
before I really felt compelled to I guess, come back to the rest of the world, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So, and you were asking about it, in relationship to other animal species. Does this even exist as a concept of time, or not being in the moment? And so my experience with this, it is a really fascinating question because it kind of unpacks a lot all at once. And what I have found is that one of the things that's the most liberating for most people is to create a space where they can experience what you're describing, Jay, even temporarily. That our modern systems and modern world are constantly trying to prevent us from being in that timeless space. And I think what we're looking at again with a lot of, like, with what you're bringing up, and with a lot of these things, we have these labels and they're labeled as a problem. And really, it's like, well, is it really a problem, or is it a gift, or is it a natural state of being that's actually more harmonious with a different society than the society we're living in? So in many, many, many different situations, in many, many different contexts, especially in time with indigenous native people, there's a very different relationship and concept of time and timelessness, and even being pushed into a time blind state is something that happens, especially in traditional ceremonies, and just having to let go of that external thing. And so to the point where there's people who live on the planet still in our modern world, even though they're maybe in a different version of it, that they don't have clocks, they don't divide the day up into hours, they don't do days of the week, and that's for everybody. And it may be that instead, in those situations, there's maybe one or two people within those groups that have some sort of capacity to actually pay attention to time naturally. But that it's the opposite of our modern world. And so I would say that what you're describing, Jay, is the natural state for a lot of people, and a lot of people historically. And our insistence on time, and ever sort of like measured pieces of time is more of a modern phenomenon. And I love that you brought it up in relationship to wandering, because this is sort of the thing that most people find their own sense of timelessness when they're wandering. So yeah, I would say that what you're describing is more common than we realize. And I have friends, I have family members who experience time blindness, and sometimes pretty strongly, and it can create friction and challenge in their life for sure. And at the same time, acknowledging that there's whole cultures that's probably more what's cultivated and what's normal, and the people who keep track of time are the exception. I don't know if that's helpful or if that's useful, Jay. Oh, and I would say, yeah, animals, like as far as we know, they're all in that state of timelessness, right? And yeah, anyway, is that helpful, Jay?
Yeah, I think so. It was just a noticing, just something I was considering in terms of, time as a construct,
Yeah.
a human construct largely, right? I mean, there's the rotation of the planet. Certainly, that's there are certain markers of time that
Yeah.
are universal to all life forms, and so there is that measuring, that understanding of when a seed needs to germinate, say under particular conditions and all that. But yeah, it was. I mean, there's so much more, like you're saying, that could be unpacked. This idea of, say athletes trying to achieve flow state.
Yeah, exactly.
Where people are trying, to zen out, if you will, for lack of a better term, but just, getting into that zone. All of these things are what I feel with time blindness. It's the same thing. It's just, instead of trying to struggle to get into the zone, it's been a constant struggle to not be in the zone, to a degree that becomes detrimental to everything else that needs to get done.
Yes, I love that. That's exactly the best way to put it. It's like actually getting out of the zone is the hard part. And again, like in my mind, it's like, well, what a gift. I mean, I know, and I don't want to belittle like the challenges that someone faces in the modern world. I had a student years ago who was naturally extremely quiet, extremely still, could sit still for hours at a time, and kind of enter naturally into like a thoughtless state relatively easily, especially outside. And she was just really struggling, and she's like, yeah, Nate, like I just don't feel like I fit in with things, or like my gifts, like what do I do with this. And I helped her realize, like, well, in a whole chunk of the world, especially East Asian and South Asian meditation traditions, people are trying to achieve what she is able to achieve kind of naturally and effortlessly. And it's just, we live in a society that's not valued. So yeah, thank you for that, Jay. And yeah, I agree that the studying flow states around this is very interesting, because that is, again, like recognized as this sort of optimal brain state for us. And that's something we only, that supposedly people only experience some of the time. And it's like, well, actually, maybe we can experience that more frequently. So, all right, well, thanks. Well, I'll come back and do some more questions in a little bit. I just want to check out these last couple of things. So I was talking about our relationship with food, and the idea that this is something we've had an experience with for a long time. And yeah, there's a seasonal aspect to this. Like as we get more in touch with our food, speaking of the idea of time, there's these much larger cycles. The solar cycles of the year, the solar cycles of the day, and having a connection with our food, foraging some food, growing some food, even just like going to a you-pick farm, a you-pick berry farm, a you-pick apple farm, can really help at least touch into those natural longings of our brain. there's this bigger category of what we call survival skills. And for me, one of the ways I've seen this time and time again is people's relationship with fire, that helping them rekindle, and I know that it's like a pun, but it's intentional there, to rekindle your relationship with fire. Again, fire being this kind of thing that we actually all are expecting to see and interact with at least some of the time. And, literally having students sometimes from urban areas come and, having instructors who are working with them and are doing like a bow drill fire, a friction fire for the first time. And the kids aren't just excited about the bow drill, they're excited because they're seeing a flame for the first time, like an actual flame. They've never seen that. And if you think about the idea that our brains, our primary source of light, besides the sun, light, warmth, source of cooking, source of heat, besides the sun for millennia was fire, that our need for fire is very deep in our psyche. And again, coming back to the theme of today, ADD, ADHD, if you spend time, so there's this fascinating thing with fire. So fire is it's constantly moving. It's constantly doing things, right? It flickers, and it actually takes a fair amount of energy to get it going, and it takes a fair amount of energy and to tend it and keep it going, especially depending on the conditions. But the traditional setting of gathering around a fire at night, that's like it pops, it clicks, it flickers, and our need to, and then imagine gathering in conversation and song and dance and story around a fire at night, and that fire needing attention. But so many people I know of talking about that the fire is so soothing and quieting to the mind, and that fire moves constantly, it flickers constantly, it takes our attention, it takes a portion of our attention. And again, like speaking for myself, if I have that fire there, suddenly my ability to be receptive and to listen and hear others or hear a story or sing a song is enhanced. It's not decreased, like as opposed to, being in a classroom and like having somebody stand up at the front of the classroom and talk at me. And I gotta say, full disclosure here, I am one of those students. I did go to like public school, and then I went to a private high school or semi-private high school. I could sit in classrooms and I could like take notes and listen and do pretty well. But whatever my awareness and intelligence and being thrives much more around the multi-sensory stimulating qualities of nature. It's like with the fire, it's like there's a smell, there's light, there's sound, there's interaction. There's a lot there for our brain to interact with. And so one of the things, we may be experiencing is our brains not having enough to interact with. It's not that there's too much, though there's that argument with our phones and everything, but that it's actually not enough. So I encourage people to really look at these primary things: time and nature, natural movement, your relationship with food, even foraging, fire. And then I'm going to type the other ones in here in the chat right now, and then I'll come back to them maybe next time. But I'm going to call this next one the Book of Nature, and it's basically all relationship with the various different species in your bioregion. And the really quick version of this, I'll just say, is like, again, our brains are expecting to have a relationship with all of these things out there. And if we don't actually know them and have a relationship with them, going outside can be disorienting. And actually, our education system is right now set up where a lot of times kids know more about bioregions really far away from them than they know about the actual animals and plants and trees in their own area. So relationships with species. Another one of these is bird language and interaction specifically with the birds and what the birds are saying. And I'm going to be co-teaching a full class on that, a course on that coming up. Other survival skills and or especially making stuff. To realize that like for a long time we made stuff by hand, and I'm a little bit less of this kind of person, but I've had a lot of friends, a lot of people who they do so much better if they can do something with their hands. And the classic sort of stereotype of this is a woman knitting and women sitting together in a circle knitting. And we can break that stereotype with all sorts of ways, but that there is this idea of like using our hands to make something as a way to thrive. Doing this in a village or this multi-generational setting, that we have these expectations of doing this with a group of people that, again, our brains are not really expecting to just be isolated and only with like a certain narrow age range, that actually, you know, on a daily basis, we may have interacted with people all the way from infants to elders continuously. And now we're just sort of segmented out into these different categories. And what does that do to us? You know, like what are we designed to do, and what does that do when we interact that way? So you know, I will talk about more of this stuff in a maybe next week or maybe in a couple weeks. There's a few other things I might throw in here, but this is kind of my personal relationship with, these are the things, if I can find ways to put these things into my life, I function better, my kids function better, my partner functions better, we all thrive, and our brains, whatever version of neuro divergence we have, actually excel and do really well when we build these things into our life, even in small amounts, even if it's just a little bit every day and some on the weekends and maybe some in the evenings. So yeah, I think that next week or the next time we get together and do this, I'll talk about some of these other categories, and then maybe we'll have a chance for people to share about their vision, their ideas of how to like create a world where these things are more present for ourselves and our kids and everything. So yeah, Jay, did you have any last questions or comments before we wrap up for today? And thanks for tuning in live.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Just more thinking on this potential connection. I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts been put towards, you know, say if ADHD markers such as time blindness are, say, you know, consistent in most life forms on the planet, is it possible then that the rest of the planet being time blind, does that not make ADHD markers such as that more significant indicators of an inherent connection to the natural world? Just wondering if you know, when we're saying like you take a child who's being diagnosed with ADHD and you take them outside and they get some nature time, they can find a baseline after, you're saying, like about 36 hours, and they come alive and suddenly they're just like, wow, they seem to be, you know, I don't know, for lack of a better term, you know, more normal in society's eyes in a certain way, or they're just energized. They're more full of life, right? They're more, they seem more balanced, more, say, just in that, you know, a flow state, say, with themselves,
Yeah.
with their beingness. As we're trying to contain so much of society in constraints of not just with time, but just in all manners of physical and non-physical forms, is there something, I'm just wondering, you know, you have to ask the question, is ADHD somehow related to an inner wildness, a wild trait, you know, that's being the attempts at domestication
Yeah.
And control are really what starts to come into play here, and are the folks who are struggling the most with ADHD in this modern society really struggling with with this attempt to control this inner wild? Question.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly my take on it. And I think I mentioned in the last time I did this, I've gotten in trouble at conferences for saying that. And then, had people come up later and, on the side say, thank you so much for saying that. I certainly think that's the case. I think that, I think we have to be, and this is kind of why I got in trouble with my, and I didn't really get in trouble. Some of my editors just said, okay, like, let's be careful of how we word this section. But they're like, and there's some things you probably can't say, like, Nate, you can't say that time and nature cures autism. And I'm like, okay, fair enough. I get it. But this isn't just, people with ADHD. It's all sorts of labels of neurodivergence, or what some people call neuroexceptional, or even related to anxiety and depression. And people I know very intimately, like, having struggled with real intense anxious depression, and then realizing if they just got outside a certain amount every day, they were fine. That's not in my mind, that's not a statement about them. That's a statement of, it's a symptom of the problems we have as a society. Yeah. So specifically with the time blindness and ADHD, there's a great story. I can't remember if I put this in one of my books or not, but one of my students went on, and they're a person who had different labels, it's, on themselves as well. And they came to Wilderness Shore School, and they just thrived. They just were there when they were 18 or 19 in the immersion program. And they just burst into liveliness, and then excelled in the apprenticeship program. And then later, after they left, did this field work in Northern Canada, and went to Africa, and then went and did their PhD at Cambridge. So hugely successful, academically and in the ancestral skills world, the rewilding world. She was telling me stories of how there was a native tribe she worked with in Northern Canada, and she spent some time with, and they had done all this work to create their own indigenous school that taught things like math and science and language, including their indigenous language, and used their culture to create a school that reflected their own cultural values. But the superintendent of the school, her son, would never show up, wouldn't go to school. And she had to recognize that he was a hunter at heart. And there was a saying in that tribe that there's at least one in every family, and their job is to just go wander and go hunt. And trying to stuff them into a classroom is just not gonna work. That's their being. And so they were able to create a space for that person, that young man, to go out and hunt. And sometimes he would show up to the school, if he was given that freedom. But even though they had designed this school in a very different way than many of our public schools say, that he still needed to go hunt. And that there was an understanding in the tribe that that's an inherent human condition for a certain number of people. And I would just say that many of the labels we give people, that we may or may not medicate them for, when those kids are taken out in nature, it's not only, in adults, it's not only that they are sort of more functional in some sense, or maybe they can interact in a way that makes everybody else feel better or something. Those skills, those same things that are diagnosed as a problem, are actually skills that that give them an edge in nature. It gives them the ability to be really tuned into bird language, to be able to track and pay attention to their surroundings better, to be exceptional trackers, maybe to be able to tell the difference between plants on this subtle level that other people can't do. Many of them were extremely good at making things with their hands. And when they were given the opportunity to make stone tools, or make arrows, or, do bow drill, they were just really good at that.
Yep.
In a way that their peers, who were not neurodivergent in any way or shape or form, weren't necessarily having that edge. So I think there's a lot there, Jay, that we can unpack around, like, well, what's really going on, and is this something is inherently human, that is kind of potentially threatening to our current world system and view. And it is, I think, I like your term, that it's our inner wildness. And we as human beings in the 21st century have some big challenges around really looking at our inner wildness and how to nurture it and what to do with it. So thanks for that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for broaching the subject and bringing this up. I know it comes up. I hear it once in a while in terms of like, yeah, ADHD is my superpower, and yet, being in, my relationship with my partner, who's the absolute polar opposite,
Right.
in every single way, very much all about time, and
Yep.
it's been quite a struggle for us to figure out, well, how do we synchronize?
Right. How do we synchronize exactly? Literally, yeah. Yeah, I'll be honest, Jay, I'm one of those people that I inherently keep track of time unconsciously, like almost to the minute. And like I can, tell myself to wake up at 7:59, and my brain will usually wake up at 7:59, and I don't understand what that is. And my partner and ex-partners tend to be more like what you're describing, and somehow we make it work. And yeah, maybe that's a really balanced couple if you have both of those sides represented, so.
Yeah. Have you noticed any prevalence for more of a night owl proclivity with ADHD versus not, folks who would not be, I guess, categorized that way?
Well, that's a great question. And I guess I would say is like, and I'm sure you're aware of this, what we call ADHD, there's a lot of different variations under that, So the version that maybe my wife and I suffer from is like the inability to really sit still, and it's kind of a restlessness, and I need to move, and like I need to do different things at the same, literally do a lot of different tasks to feel nourished and not bored.
Right.
And both of us go to bed early and wake up early. It's just like our natural biorhythm. But I do really buy into, I think there's a huge thing we could look at around, there's actually at least 3 major sleep patterns that humans generally had, and it's an adaptive function that we used to keep watch at night, right? And there were people that they were probably biologically inclined to stay up late and be the people tending the fire and watching for animals or other people, and then there are people designed to wake up early, and there's people designed kind of in between, like that need to take a nap in the middle of the day or whatever. Like, so, and I think, go ahead.
Just that's been sort of my observation as well. And it seems like there's, the minority of people are the ones who, have seen the sunrise more often because they've been up all night than because they got up early. But that, in a more historical sense, the people who are keeping the tribe safe, you don't need a great number. You might just need one person per group of people to be eyes and ears for that duration, so everyone else sleeps safely. And so I'm just wondering, it just seems like a genetic predisposition or a trait would be much less pronounced throughout a culture in a minority number account that way, because you don't need everyone to stay up all night. You just need, a small fraction to make sure everyone still gets up in the morning with their heads connected to their bodies or whatever.
And I think that there may be also an age piece about it. Like it's kind of like 16 to like 30. It's like more prevalent, and as people get older, it's much less likely that they'll have that desire. Though there might be some variety there. And then also, just like the same thing about our own relationship to sleep, that especially in the northern hemisphere or the far northern hemisphere or the far southern hemisphere, it's pretty clear people slept a lot less in the summertime and the springtime and slept more in the fall and the winter. And that this idea that we're supposed to somehow get exactly 8 hours of sleep every night consistently for the whole year doesn't actually reflect the natural patterns around us for most of us. Maybe if we lived at the equator, I don't know, maybe it's more common there, but where you get 12 hours of darkness every night, like, but it's just not really, I think, what we're designed for either. At least, and I've even heard some people, do some work around the bipolar and seeing that, bipolar often occurs in populations that historically come from more northern climates, and that there's some relationship between bipolar and these seasonal cycles that we don't understand yet. But so
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Jay, and thanks to everybody who's watching the recording of this. I'll send this out. This will probably go out on Monday for everybody, maybe Tuesday, and then probably in a couple weeks we'll do another one of these on a Friday. And appreciate everybody. And as always, go ahead and send questions, comments, stories. I love to hear people's stories to me at primalnate@gmail.com. And thanks again for being live with me today, Jay. And thanks for your questions and stories.
Definitely. Thank you, Nate. Much appreciated.
All right. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Look forward to next time.
Yeah. And I'm going to get outside and wander around now. Go have some time with this.
Awesome.
All right. See you later.
Take care. Bye.